Hey, how's it going, everyone? It's Blake here from chesspathways.com, and in today's openings video, we're going to be discussing the Chigorin Defense. The Chigorin Defense starts out as a Queen's Gambit, so d4, d5, c4, and instead of playing one of Black's main options here like the Slav Defense or the Queen's Gambit declined or the Queen's Gambit accepted, Black's going to play knight to c6. This is the starting position of the Chigorin Defense. And this looks a bit unusual at first because if White were to take on d5, now Black cannot recapture with the pawn. They would have to take with their queen, and we know the queen can often be harassed when it has to come to d5 this early. But Black has some ideas up their sleeve. For starters, after c takes d5, queen takes d5, White can't really play knight c3 right away to attack the queen, because then simply queen takes d4 wins a pawn for Black. That's the whole idea of having this knight on c6. So let's see what White could do instead. One of White's main moves is to play pawn to e3, simply defending this pawn, opening up the bishop, and next White would like to play knight c3 and kick that queen away, but now Black's going to play e5 and keep up the pressure, putting pressure on this d4 pawn and also opening up this bishop, so after knight c3, Black doesn't have to waste time by retreating, Black can just develop another piece and pin that knight. After White plays bishop d2 to threaten the queen again, Black can eliminate the knight, and often White wants to take with the pawn because this brings another pawn closer to the center, and White might be thinking about pushing forward with c4 at some point. And after Black plays the normal developing move knight to f6, White has a couple different ideas here. One is to play c4 right away and try to kick this queen away, the idea being to advance forward with d5 and kick that knight on c6 away. And now White does have a space advantage over here on the center and on the queen side, but White's also leaving some squares behind as they advance these pawns. For example, this c5 square is now an outpost, and Black can often try to route a knight into that square. For example, knight e7, queen b3, that's one move White sometimes plays. Also, queen b1 is sometimes played. I've seen that move before. Potentially thinking about stopping bishop f5 because the b-pawn would still be hanging. And if knight f5, at least the queen would keep an eye on that square. But queen b3 is another move. Black could play here a5. Black's just trying to stop White from playing bishop b4 and taking control of this diagonal. Knight f3 developing a piece, but here comes knight e4, attacking this bishop and swinging into c5. Again, that's another advantage to having the queen on b1 and watching over these squares a bit better. It'd be a bit harder for Black to swing that knight into the c5 outpost. And now we have a pretty imbalanced game. White has this space advantage, but Black's blockading these pawns pretty well for the time being, and Black might even think about pushing f5 and grabbing some space over on the king side. So that's one way the game could go. And coming back here to the position after knight f6, we talked about playing c4 and d5. One of White's other ideas would be to play f3 here, thinking about playing e4 and then d5 and then c4, really trying to build up a space advantage here on the queen side and stabilizing the center a little bit by having this pawn on e4. It's pretty hard for Black to stop this pawn from advancing to e4, so let's see how the game could go here. After castles, e4, queen back to d6, d5, the knight gets kicked away, now c4, and White would love to be able to finish up development and then play c5 and really steamroll Black over here on the d and c files, but of course this doesn't come without its disadvantages. This f3 pawn takes away the best square from the knight, and Black's going to try to get a pawn break of their own in by playing f5. So let's just take a quick look. Knight to d7, freeing up this f-pawn and watching over c5, a great multi-purpose move. Knight e2, knight c5, knight c3, c6, starting to try to tear down White's center potentially. Bishop e2, and here comes pawn to f5. Once again with a pretty imbalanced game. In this position, after c takes d5, queen takes d5, we talked about playing here simply pawn to e3, and how Black could play e5. Another attempt by White might be to play knight to f3, just once again guarding this pawn, thinking about playing knight c3 next, but this actually doesn't stop Black from playing e5. Black can still play this move, because it would be pretty hard for White to try to hold on to this pawn if they grab it. If White plays d takes e5 here, Black could trade queens, force the White king to d1, and this e5 pawn is probably going to be lost, so White doesn't often go for this. Instead, White usually still plays knight c3, Black plays bishop b4 as we know, but in this line the bishop could take on c3 instead of the pawn taking. So we could see bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3, and we get a different kind of position. And here, Black often wants to push this pawn to e4 so this bishop doesn't get opened up, and it also, of course, gains this tempo on the knight. One of Black's ideas is this pawn sacrifice. After knight e5, Black can play here e3, trying to take advantage of the fact that this bishop is not on this diagonal anymore, and it's just a positional pawn sacrifice. The point is, if White takes with the f-pawn, now Black can take on e5, And these white's going to end up with tripled pawns here. Simply d takes e5, knight e7, just reinforcing the queen while black develops a piece. And white's up a pawn for the time being, but this bishop has a hard time developing, and it's hard to imagine these tripled pawns are really, at their full potential here. So that's one interesting idea black has in this line. Usually white will decline this pawn sacrifice after e3. White could simply play f3, avoid tripling their pawns, and try to pick up this pawn later. But for the time being, this pawn's a pretty big thorn in white's side, really stopping them from easily developing their kingside pieces. One sample here could be knight g to e7, queen d3, threatening to pick up this potentially vulnerable pawn. Knight takes e5, d takes e5, black trades queens to avoid losing that pawn too quickly, and now knight d5. And black has actually fared pretty well from this position from what I could find in my database. It's still yet to be determined if this pawn is just a weakness that's going to be picked up, or if it's going to grant black a nice initiative here. For example, knight f4 could be an idea. Black still has some active ideas they can consider while white scrambles to finish up their development. Alright, so coming back to the starting position of the Chigorin defense, we've seen what happens after white plays c takes d5, which looks like the obvious move, but because we've seen that black gets some pretty decent play there, it should come as no surprise that a lot of players with white avoid going for this, and simply go for some other move. Knight c3 is a common one here, simply attacking the d5 pawn again, and we'll just take a look at a couple sample lines of how the game could go from here. Of course, black could take on c4, that's actually the main line in this position. Of course, white was ready to gambit that pawn on move 2 when they played the queen's gambit, so they're more than happy to sacrifice it on move 3. They're probably going to get it back. Here, white often plays knight to f3, just defending this d4 pawn. And white could think about playing e3 just to grab this pawn back, or white could even be more ambitious and try to play e4. For example, here, after knight f6, white could play e4, taking the full center and threatening this pawn. And if black plays bishop g4, trying to increase the pressure here on d4, that's one of the downsides to not having the pawn on e3, but white can deal with this pressure. White could play bishop e3 to reinforce that pawn for the time being, and now black is kind of out of threats, and white's going to pick up their pawn. For example, e6, bishop takes c4. Black has some pretty active development here, and might hope to still generate pressure against white's center, but certainly having full control of the center is a nice advantage for white. Another sample of how the game could go here after knight c3. Black has occasionally tried playing e5 right away. That's definitely an interesting try to continue to strike at the white center. And play can become rather forcing here. After c takes d5, black can play knight takes d4, e3, knight f5, knight f3, now the e-pawn's under attack. Black could defend it with bishop d6, and now bishop b5 check. White's idea is to force the light-squared bishops off the board before white commits their pawns to light squares. For example, bishop d7, the bishops come off the board, and now pawn to e4. And once again, we get a pretty familiar pawn structure here that we've seen before. White has this pawn on d5. This time there's no c-pawn, that's one difference. But black is still relying on their blockade of this pawn. They still might try to play f5 later. They might try to play c6 like we've seen before and try to fight back against this d-pawn. But for the time being, white has a space advantage. The game might continue knight fe7 and castles. And of course, both sides are going to pursue their own agendas from here. Finally, I'll just briefly show an example of what happens if white just plays e3 to grab the pawn back. After, for example, knight to f6, knight f3, black could once again think about taking on c4. White's really in no rush to defend that pawn. We've seen what happens if white plays e4 here. Let's say white just plays e3. Black could play bishop g4 and try to avoid locking in that bishop, but white's really not too concerned about that because their pawn is very solid now. Bishop takes c4, e6, h3, putting the question to this bishop. White would be happy to pick up the bishop pair if black exchanged. And after bishop h5, white could even play bishop b5. This bishop's kind of far from home, black's still a couple moves away from getting castled, so white might want to make black worry a bit about some problems on this diagonal, either the doubled pawns, or potentially ideas with queen a4 and knight e5 really trying to pile up on this knight because the bishop's so far away. So this could be one way white tries to play as well, with the more timid e3 instead of the e4 move to grab the full center. Alright, thanks for watching. Please go visit chesspathways.com right now and get signed up. I'll put a link down in the description. It's totally free, only takes 5 seconds to join, and I'll send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you sign up. It took me way too long to become a chess master. Let me help you do it in a fraction of the time. Thanks, and I will see you there.